The sun had already sunk beneath the horizon on the evening of August 14, 1945. The air was thick with heat and dust as the soldiers shuffled back and forth, securing the perimeter of a Japanese prison camp in the Pacific. Inside, there was a subdued sense of discomfort. The weariness of war and the strain of months of captivity hung heavily on both the prisoners and their captors. The Japanese women officers, sitting in rows on the cold, hard benches, exchanged quiet glances. They had been through it all: bombings, endless interrogations, hunger, and fear. But nothing had prepared them for the shocking event about to unfold. Suddenly, a soldier appeared from the darkness, his face set in stern seriousness. The women froze, unsure of what to expect. Their eyes darted between each other as they tried to make sense of the tension in the air. Then, without warning, the soldier issued an order that would forever change their perception of the enemy, of the war itself. He instructed the guards to bring forth a large, bulky piece of machinery, a film projector. The women were puzzled. The cold, rigid discipline they had lived by for years under Japanese command seemed worlds apart from the unusual request of their captors. What were they to make of this strange invitation? Was it some sort of cruel joke? The room went silent again as the machine whirred to life. The moment the light flickered and the first image appeared on the screen, something inside the women shifted. The flickering black and white images from the projector pulsed with life, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, their minds were distracted, completely captivated by a piece of American culture they had never imagined encountering. The first film they saw, an old classic from the 1930s, was an innocent enough romantic comedy. Yet to these officers who had spent months in the isolation of a war-torn camp, it was an unprecedented experience, a break from the constant tension of war and duty. The strange, unfamiliar sounds of American laughter on the screen echoed through the room, and the women found themselves caught between disbelief and fascination. This simple act, the screening of a film, marked the beginning of an extraordinary moment in history, one that would forever change their perception of the American enemy. The film projector, however, wasn't just a tool of entertainment. It was a psychological weapon. For the women, it represented the first crack in the wall that had been built between them and the reality of the war. They had been trained to see the Americans as heartless enemies, faceless adversaries. But in that dimly lit room, watching those old Hollywood scenes unfold, they were confronted with something unexpected: the humanity of the very soldiers they had been taught to despise. The question that hung in the air was unspoken but loud. How could such a brutal enemy also have the capacity for compassion? As the first film played out, the women couldn't help but exchange cautious glances. Was this a gesture of kindness, or was there something deeper at play? But as the movie ended and the guards moved to silence the projector, one thing was undeniable. The war, at least for this brief moment, had shifted from being a relentless battle for dominance to something far more complex and personal. It was the first of many films that the American soldiers would screen in that camp, but it was the one that forever etched itself in the minds of the Japanese women officers. What had started as an act of shock, perhaps even disdain, slowly evolved into a profound moment of reflection. It was not the military victories or strategic calculations that would define this conflict. It was something far subtler. At that moment, the Japanese women officers found themselves struggling with a new realization. The war was not simply a fight between nations or ideologies. It was a conflict fought by real people, with real emotions, fears, and vulnerabilities. But what led to this moment? How did the brutal forces of war create the conditions for such a subtle yet transformative experience? The answer lies in the broader geopolitical shifts that defined the war in the Pacific and the unexpected human interactions that arose from it. The Pacific theater of World War II had been a brutal, unrelenting battle of survival, conquest, and ideological clash. By 1945, the tide of the war had shifted significantly in favor of the Allies, but the struggle was far from over. The Japanese Empire, having endured a relentless campaign of island hopping, strategic bombardments, and naval blockades, was now facing the terrifying reality of total defeat. The war had begun in the Pacific in 1937, with the Japanese invasion of China, but it wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 that the United States officially entered the conflict. For the next 3 years, the Pacific became a battleground defined by brutal naval and air engagements, with the Japanese and the Americans locked in a deadly struggle. Key moments like the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal Campaign, and the Battle of Iwo Jima marked the high points of this prolonged conflict. By mid-1945, Japan was clearly on the defensive. The Allies had successfully broken Japan's naval dominance and had made significant inroads into Japanese-held territories. The US had even reached the Japanese home islands, a mere stone's throw away from Tokyo. But still, Japan refused to surrender. The government of Emperor Hirohito, bolstered by the stubbornness of its military elite, was prepared to fight to the last man, even as the country itself lay in ruins. The idea of surrender was seen as dishonorable, a blow to the honor of the Japanese people. The American leadership, however, was equally determined to end the war swiftly and decisively. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office in April 1945 after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, faced mounting pressure to bring the war to a close. The U.S. military had suffered tremendous losses, and the prospect of a ground invasion of Japan seemed increasingly unappealing. The brutal nature of the Pacific conflict had shown no mercy to either side, and the war's high casualties made a final, all-out invasion of Japan seem like an unbearable prospect. Amidst these shifting tides, the United States unleashed a new weapon that would irrevocably change the course of history: the atomic bomb. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb took place in the New Mexico desert as part of the Manhattan Project. The bomb, with its unimaginable power, was designed to provide the United States with the means to bring an end to the war once and for all. It was a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. But even as the development of the atomic bomb progressed, the Allies continued their traditional methods of warfare. Massive firebombing raids ravaged Japanese cities, killing tens of thousands of civilians and turning entire neighborhoods into rubble. The most devastating raid occurred on the night of March 9 at 10, 1945, when American bombers dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, killing an estimated 100,000 people in one night. As these air raids devastated Japan, the women officers in the prison camps felt the shifting winds of war. They had experienced firsthand the destruction caused by the Allied forces, and the mental and emotional toll it took on them was immense. But what they didn't know was that they were nearing the final stages of a conflict that would forever change their understanding of warfare and human survival. The pivotal moment arrived on August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb exploded with an unprecedented ferocity, instantly killing over 70,000 people and leaving the city in ruins. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, further devastating the country. The sheer scale of the destruction was beyond comprehension. Japan was now facing an existential crisis. The effects of the bombings were immediate and devastating, not just in terms of the physical damage, but also in the psychological toll it took on the Japanese people and leadership. In the wake of these bombings, Japan's military leadership faced an agonizing decision: surrender or face complete annihilation. The emperor, who had been revered as a divine figure, was finally faced with the reality that his country could no longer continue the fight. The idea of surrender, once unthinkable, had now become a bitter necessity. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender to the Allies. But even as the Japanese government made its decision, many of the women officers in the camps were still processing the shock of the situation. To them, the war had always been a fight for survival and honor. They had been trained to defend their homeland with every ounce of their strength, never imagining that one day they would find themselves on the receiving end of such a devastating and overwhelming force. For the officers in the camp, the news of Japan's surrender came as a shock. The American soldiers who had been guarding them, who had been their captors for months, were now their deliverers. The shift in power was jarring. And yet, as the Japanese women officers sat in silence, watching the flickering images from the film projector, they could sense something else emerging. Something deeper than just the immediate shock of the bombings or the surrender. It was a recognition that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in history, one that was reshaping not just the war, but the very nature of humanity itself. The hum of the projector filled the otherwise silent room. It was an unusual sound, a soft, mechanical whirring that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic noise of war that had once dominated this place. For the women officers in the prison camp, the experience of watching an American film was both jarring and captivating. As the images flickered across the screen, the soldiers, once fierce and resolute in their duty, were now consumed by something far less tangible than strategy or tactics. They were witnessing the world outside, the world of their captors, through a lens they had never expected. The movie that played before them was simple, a light-hearted tale of romance and comedy. Yet it carried with it the essence of a world far removed from their own. They watched as American actors laughed and loved, as characters navigated struggles and triumphs that seemed so distant from the harsh realities of war. The film, though in many ways foreign to them, held an unexpected power. It humanized the enemy. The laughter, the emotions, the struggles of the characters on screen created a bridge between the world of the captors and the captured. For the first time, the women officers began to see their American captors not as faceless soldiers of an enemy nation, but as real people with lives, hopes, and dreams. This was a revelation of sorts, an acknowledgement that the brutality of war could not erase the shared humanity between them. It was a realization that, despite the uniforms, the weapons, and the violence, they were all bound by the same human experience. This moment, one defined by a shared experience of watching a movie, marked a turning point not just for the women in the camp, but for the nature of warfare itself. As the film ended, the women sat in stunned silence. The guards who had been standing watch over the projector remained still as well, perhaps understanding the significance of the moment. The atmosphere in the room was no longer one of tension and animosity, but of something subtler, perhaps understanding, perhaps even an uneasy bond between captor and captive. There was no celebration, no victory. There was only the lingering echo of the film's message, that beyond the uniforms, beyond the ranks, there were people like them, caught in the maelstrom of war, doing what they could to survive. The psychological shift that occurred in the camp that evening was not something that could be easily explained or understood. The women officers had long been indoctrinated with a sense of duty to their emperor, to their country, and to their fellow soldiers. They had been trained to see the war as a necessary struggle, a fight for honor and a battle for the survival of their nation. To them, surrender had always been anathema. Yet now, in the quiet of the camp, as they sat and processed what they had just witnessed, something else emerged, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, there could be more to life than this endless cycle of violence and hatred. It was in this moment that the full weight of the situation began to settle upon them. The surrender of Japan, the devastation caused by the atomic bombs, the unrelenting toll of the war, all of it had culminated in this surreal, unexpected moment. The Americans, who had once been seen as a faceless enemy, had now opened a window into their world. And through that window, the Japanese officers saw not just soldiers and captives, but human beings who were bound by the same fears, hopes, and dreams that had defined their own lives. For the American soldiers, the act of showing these films was not simply a form of entertainment. It was an act of psychological warfare, one designed to weaken the resolve of the enemy by introducing an unexpected element into the equation: humanity. In a war that had often been defined by the starkest of ideologies, where each side viewed the other as subhuman, the act of sharing a film was a momentary bridge between two worlds. It was a fleeting reminder that beneath the layers of propaganda, training, and duty, the soldiers of both sides were not so different after all. As the women officers filed out of the room after the screening, the camp was filled with an uneasy silence. The American soldiers went about their duties, seemingly unaware of the profound impact their gesture had had on the prisoners. The guards stood at attention, their faces unreadable as if they too were caught up in the unspoken significance of what had just transpired. No one said a word, but in that silence 1,000 unspoken thoughts filled the air. What had been a war of hatred, ideology, and propaganda had, for one brief moment, been transformed into something else, a recognition of shared humanity. In the days that followed, the women officers could not shake the image of the film from their minds. It lingered in their thoughts, intruding on their daily routines, forcing them to confront the harsh reality of their situation. They were no longer just soldiers of the empire. They were human beings caught in the tides of history, struggling to survive, to make sense of a world that seemed increasingly alien and incomprehensible. This shift in perspective was not an easy one to accept. For many of the officers, the realization that they were in fact on the losing side of the war was a painful blow to their sense of duty and honor. They had been trained to believe in the righteousness of their cause, but now, the truth was undeniable. The war was over and their side had lost. The surrender was not just a military defeat. It was a profound personal reckoning. In the quiet aftermath of the movie screenings, the women began to reflect on what had brought them here. They thought of the families they had left behind, the comrades who had fallen in battle, and the lives they had once known before the war had consumed them. The war had taken so much from them, and now, in the aftermath of the surrender, they were left with little more than the bitter taste of defeat and the overwhelming question of what would come next. But in the midst of this despair, there was also a flicker of hope. The war, with all its brutality, was over, and while the wounds of battle would take time to heal, the first step towards rebuilding could begin. It was a difficult journey, one that would require patience and understanding, but it was a journey nonetheless. The war had left its mark on all those who had fought, but the films, those fleeting moments of human connection, had given them something else, a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, the shared experience of being human could still shine through. As the days passed in the prison camp, a new reality began to take shape. The Japanese women officers who had once believed in the invincibility of their cause were now confronted with the inescapable truth of their defeat. The war, which had defined every aspect of their lives for so long, was over. But what did it mean to surrender, to accept defeat when everything they had been trained to believe in was suddenly called into question? The immediate consequences of Japan's surrender were felt across the Pacific, but within the prison camps, the true impact was more subtle. The American soldiers, who had spent years fighting against the Japanese Empire, now faced a complex challenge: how to treat the prisoners who had once been their bitter enemies. For some, the decision to extend basic decency was an easy one, rooted in a sense of honor and humanity. For others, it was more difficult. How could they look beyond the years of bloodshed, the lives lost, and the hatred that had defined their relationship with the Japanese? For the women officers, this moment of surrender was equally complex. Their sense of honor, deeply ingrained through years of training and cultural tradition, now collided with the brutal reality of defeat. In their minds, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Yet in the face of overwhelming destruction, both physical and psychological, the decision had already been made for them. The atomic bombs had effectively ended the war, and with them any hope for a victorious conclusion. What remained was a struggle for survival, for understanding, and for finding a way to move forward. The films shown by the American soldiers served as a window into this new world, one where the enemy was no longer a faceless adversary but a real, complex force. In that small prison camp where the noise of war had once been deafening, the flickering images on the screen provided a brief respite, a momentary glimpse into a different reality. And though these films were only a brief distraction, they had a profound effect. They were a reminder that beyond the battlefield, beyond the horrors of war, there were lives to be rebuilt, cultures to be understood, and humanity to be rediscovered. The days that followed the surrender saw a flurry of activity in the camps. Prisoners were processed, their fates uncertain. Some would be repatriated, others would remain in captivity for a time, but all were faced with the uncertain future of a post-war world. For the women officers, the challenge was not only physical but emotional. How would they reconcile their sense of duty and honor with the reality of their defeat? How would they, as individuals and as a nation, come to terms with the idea that their empire, which had once seemed so powerful, had been reduced to rubble? But amidst the uncertainty, there was a quiet, creeping realization. The world was changing and it would never be the same again. The war had revealed both the darkest and the brightest sides of humanity. The destruction of entire cities, the horrific use of atomic weapons, and the inhuman treatment of prisoners all served as stark reminders of what was at stake when nations clashed. But on the other hand, the acts of compassion, the moments of understanding between captor and captive, and the ability of people to find common ground amidst the wreckage of war also offered a glimmer of hope for the future. For the women officers, The war was not just a conflict between two nations. It was a clash of ideologies, cultures, and personal identities. The films shown in the prison camp had been a simple gesture, but they were also a powerful symbol of the possibility for change. They had witnessed the humanity of their enemies in a way they had never imagined. The American soldiers who had once been their captors were now revealed to be people just like them, flawed, vulnerable, and capable of kindness. The realization that this shared humanity transcended borders, uniforms, and ideologies was a profound one, and it left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it. In the years that followed the war, the world would undergo a dramatic transformation. The horrors of World War II would give rise to new global structures, institutions, and ideologies. The United Nations was formed, aimed at preventing future conflicts and fostering international cooperation. The rise of the Cold War and the subsequent arms race would shape the world for decades to come. But at the same time, the aftermath of the war would also bring about deep reflections on the nature of conflict, human rights, and the importance of empathy in the face of war. For the Japanese women officers, the road to reconciliation would be long and fraught with difficulty. Some would return to Japan, where they would face a country in ruins struggling to rebuild in the wake of defeat. Others would stay in the occupied territories, adjusting to a new world order under American supervision. The psychological scars of the war would linger for many years, but the experiences they had lived through, including the unexpected film screenings, would serve as a reminder of the capacity for change, both within individuals and within nations. The war, for all its horrors, had also shown that even in the most devastating of circumstances, the possibility for connection and understanding remained. The films, the quiet moments of humanity amidst the brutality of war, represented the thin thread of hope that could weave through the darkest moments of human history. The Japanese women officers, who had once believed in the invincibility of their empire, would carry with them the memory of that moment, the moment when they saw their captors as human beings, just as vulnerable, just as scared, and just as capable of kindness as themselves. And so the legacy of this moment endures. It serves as a reminder that war, with all its destruction and pain, is ultimately a human experience. The faces on both sides of the battlefield are not just soldiers, but people who are capable of both cruelty and compassion, of destruction and creation. The experience of the Japanese women officers, the moment they sat in that dimly lit room and watched an American film, offers a profound lesson in the power of human connection and the possibility for change, even in the most difficult of times.